Most bankers aren't ready to help you until after their third cup of coffee. But with Central National Bank's after-hours service, you don't have to wait for the bank lobby to open to get help. You can contact us from 6 to 8:30 in the morning or from 5 to 10 in the evening, and we'll connect you to a real, live, local person who can answer questions and fix problems 7 days a week. Bank different. Bank Central. Central National Bank. Member FDIC.
Coming up on the Payoff. I think this is like the 10th time I've tried to record this intro because there's just not enough time or enough ways for me to jam in all that Charlie Engle is in this 1 minute before the episode. So I'll just tell you this. The fact that there isn't already a movie based on Charlie Engle's life came as a real big surprise to me once I finished up my conversation with him. He's got 30 years of sobriety, but the dude has an amazing story. Part of it was chronicled when he ran across the Sahara Desert in a documentary that was produced and narrated by Matt Damon. Another part of it, he chronicled himself in his book, Running Man. He's going to be running for 30 hours to celebrate his 30 years of recovery in an event that is connected to Ashley addiction treatment. Charlie Engle is the man, and we got about an hour with him. We didn't get 30 hours, but man, did we pack a lot into this 60 minutes. Before we get to Charlie, you know the drill. Kevin Souza.
While what you're about to see is true, this story begins at the movies. Here's Harry Smith.
Charlie Engle is one of the top ultra-marathoners in the world. He loves the freedom that comes from putting one foot in front of the other and seeing just how far he can go.
What's happening, Pete?
Hey, Charlie, what's up, man?
Man, just living the dream here.
I feel like I know you very well by now because
yeah,
you remind me a lot of myself, but you're accomplished. I've always been a runner since 18 years old, and huge speed guy, alcohol guy. I always ran no matter what. And I always felt like that was an out for me, almost like, okay, a justification to keep going. And hearing you talk about that, it's not too frequently that I run into other people in recovery that every day I would run. Regardless of what happened the night before, unless I was still up, and sometimes I still did.
Yeah. No, dude, you nailed it right there. And that is when people ask the right question, which you just did, I will answer this in front of 10,000 people in a stadium even. And that is that I freely admit that my running was a combination of health and wellness and trying to sort of purge last night's binge out of my body, or the last week's binge, or the last month's binge, and trying to, to me, it was the best way to push a lot of those poisons out of my body. But there was also a part that was about self-flagellation, about punishing myself, because I knew how to make myself hurt through running, and I felt like I deserved it. So early on in my recovery, I looking back now, I freely understand that I used running as both as a tool and as almost a weapon against myself, a punishment of sorts. And it took a lot of working through it. I think what I tried to do, Pete, in those first 3 years, because when I first got sober, I ran every single day for 3 straight years. I also went to a recovery meeting every day for 3 years. So I did those two things without missing a single day, because I kind of felt like my life depended on it. But I was trying to beat the addict out of me. I thought that guy's trying to kill me, so I'm going to kill him first. And it took those 3 years for me to understand that I was wrong about that, because the addict and my addictive nature, and I don't want to speak for you, but I'm going to guess that you feel the same. Those qualities are actually all the best parts of me. Those are the parts that make me good at stuff. Without that obsessive part of my personality, I probably wouldn't be good at anything today. So what mattered was to finally, stop the putting drinking and putting alcohol and drugs into my system, and instead directing that addictive, obsessive nature towards positive things.
Yeah, I think the running or working out, I think that can get a bad rap sometimes, because I always felt like, for me early in recovery, because people say you trade one for the other. Early on, I felt like it really helped me. Like I wouldn't, and I would die on that hill. Working out.
Did you ever pawn your computer to enter a race?
No, exactly.
Or did you ever? Right? Did you ever sell your car, to like go on an expedition? I mean, it's a ridiculous. Okay, I'm not saying that there's not somebody out there that is so, and I'm using air quotes that you can't see, addicted to exercise that they can do harm. But I got to tell you, man, that is such a thin argument. And it usually comes from people in your inner circle, or even your slightly edge circle in your life. And one of the things that I've said now for years, and I genuinely believe that it's true, even the people closest to us sometimes don't want to see us succeed. And what I mean by that is, I'm not saying they don't love us, and they've watched us with this painful behavior probably for years. But there's weird comfort in having a person that you can rely on their bad behavior. And when that bad behavior goes away, very often it changes the dynamic of the relationship. If it's a marriage, if it's just a friendship, if that's your drinking buddy and you're no longer drinking, well, I had friends who would tell me, like, hey, man, you don't need to quit. You just need to slow down. And I'm like, what are you kidding me?
After 8 days straight of being awake.
Right. Have you been watching me? I mean, if I could slow down, don't you think I would? And it took me years to realize those people, it's like they had a rope around my waist and they were just trying to pull me back to them. And that's because they were afraid of what my getting better might make them feel like. You know what I mean? Because it's a weird human nature thing.
Well, it's in our literature. I mean, it's in the 12-step literature. It's like the family afterwards. It literally is textbook.
Yep.
There's a kind of a solution for it, but it's very real. I want to jump back with you and get into the evolution of your person and your addiction. It seems like they were one and the same. You grew up in North Carolina. Your father, or your grandfather, was a track coach at North Carolina, like a legendary coach?
Totally. He was the best ever at UNC in Chapel Hill, and he was an All-American as a runner in the 20s, and then became the head track and cross-country coach for about 40 years.
Did you feel you were kind of predestined to run?
Well, in the legacy standpoint, yes. My family, unfortunately, he died. My grandfather died when I was very young, and so I didn't really know him. But, the family would always say, oh, man, you're going to be a runner just like your granddad. And I will say that stuck with me. And it turned out I wasn't a particularly talented runner. I was never going to, I ran 4:30 for the mile. And I ran some fast 5Ks and some even decent marathons once I got sober. But, you tell the average person you broke 3 hours in a marathon, they're like, wow, that's unbelievable. And then you realize that, the Boston Marathon winner is always, 2:05. Like, there's the distance between me and that guy are from here to the moon. So I was not an elite runner ever, but I found my comfort zone in super long distance.
You also found alcohol kind of early on. You grew up, your parents were 19 when they had you. So you grew up in I would guess maybe like a hippie-ish environment, like a bohemian environment I've heard you describe. What was that like?
Yeah, it was, as a kid, it was phenomenal. I was always the weird kid. I probably still am today, but, my mom was in school in Chapel Hill, and then she went to the University of Georgia, and then she went to Albany, Georgia, and then she started teaching in prisons. Like I moved to Attica, New York, where she taught, acting and writing in Attica State Prison. So I was like always this kid with long hair parted down the middle. I looked like a reasonably cute little girl. And, and so this weird, as an only child, this sort of weird adult world that I occupied taught me how to, it taught me how to speak to adults. It taught me how to engage. We didn't have phones, obviously, back then in the early 60s. So it was, you're able to carry a conversation even as a little kid, but it also taught me, to drink. I grew up in a household where it wasn't unusual to open the fridge and there's nothing in there but, beer and wine. And, I thought the smell of pot was like, some sort of incense we were burning in the house because it just always smelled that way.
And what did alcohol do for you?
Well, so there's a story I actually tell in the book that in Running Man that, I'm walking around a typical late night party at our house out in the country in Durham, North Carolina. And there's 50 people dancing in the front yard because the speakers are in the window. And, they're all, they're 22, 23, 24 years old. So just, think about, I think about myself at that age. And
yeah.
I'm a little kid wandering around the house and it's not like, I don't want it to sound, I like to say that I was lovingly neglected is how I look at it. I'm not trying to excuse my mother or the fact that I wasn't particularly well cared for, but, that particular night, there was nothing to drink in the fridge. And so, I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and I picked up a beer that was half full, on the table, and I smelled it, and of course it smelled terrible and it tasted even worse, but I drank it. I was thirsty and I drank that half beer, and I immediately felt this, warmth that many of us describe, this comfort. And as I like to say, alcohol like planted a flag in my brain on that night and like claimed that territory for itself. And it was an impactful night. It's not like I started drinking every day after that. I mean, I know that happens to some people. It's not what happened to me, but I knew I always had something to turn to. That's
you
what
could
that
count on it.
Taught me. Totally.
Yeah.
That was never going to let me down. When I needed it, it was going to be there. And I couldn't point to anything else in my life that made me feel that way.
The book, by the way, is Running Man, a memoir of ultra endurance. It's like on and off the trails. People got to check it out. And we'll kind of talk a little bit, almost like a Cliff's Notes version of that, because your story is amazing. Are you 30 years sober at this point?
Yeah, so coming up, I'm July 23rd. Assuming I don't relapse between now and then, I will have 30 years of continuous sobriety, which is if you knew me back then, is a freaking miracle. But it's it has. It's been a long journey, and I appreciate you mentioning the book. It's despite the name Running Man, it actually has very little to do with running.
Yeah.
I'm happy to say there's a lot better runners out there. If you're looking for a marathon training plan, my book will tell you why you should do it, but it's not going to teach you a damn thing about how to do it.
It'll teach you about endurance, though, and it'll and life and kind of moving forward. I've heard you talk about kind of hitting a wall, and I'm jumping forward here, but when you're running the Sahara Desert and you hit a wall, and you learn. I love when you say people when they're running. You talk about hitting a wall, right, in a marathon, and you said that they think they're going to feel like that for the rest of eternity, right? Whatever they're feeling at that moment when they hit I'll take your note with the air quotes I'm doing right now, but they hit that wall, and it's not true. They're not going to feel like that forever, and it's very similar with sobriety. You hit that wall, like I don't know, in your first month or so, and you're like, oh my God, I can't do this. And you break through it and you're okay.
Yeah, it's surviving moments. I think that is it's so much the key to I would even argue happiness. And the place I really talk about it is if you have a super emotional, I'm still an emotional guy, and I occasionally will pick a fight with my wife, and we'll have almost always my fault, but some
welcome to the human race, dude.
Yeah, right. Some terrible argument where I say a handful of things that I don't mean, and I have to apologize for, and all of that. But the point is that horrible moment that there's not a single person listening to this right now that if you've managed to go without having that kind of argument with somebody else your whole life, then I don't even know what to say about that. You're not real. Taking that moment in a relationship that's really important to you, and we project that out forever. We think we've destroyed everything that relationship could possibly be in the future because of how badly we feel in that moment. And it's just not true. So it's about learning how to let those moments slide by without making them worse. That's always my goal. Is I may have already made a mistake. I'll make another, analogy in a marathon, because that's super simple. I go the first 20 miles without drinking anything in a marathon. Now, I would never do that, but if I did, I know what's going to happen. Yeah. Like, I am going to hit that wall, and I'm going to, I know not to make it worse by going the last 6 miles without drinking. I know I need to take a drink. I need to slow down. I need to let perspective come back into the picture. And if I let that terrible, hard moment slide by, now it may take my pain level from a 10 to an 8, but as we all know from really serious emotional and physical pain, when you drop to an 8, it feels like the world has been lifted off your shoulders. There's still a lot to deal with, but I think it's this idea of resilience is all the big buzzword these days. I get hired and asked to go to places and talk about resilience. I've spoken at the United Nations and NATO headquarters in Belgium and some crazy places where resilience has been the key. And even in those places, everybody's kind of looking for a hack. Yeah. They want some shortcut to resilience. Yeah. And I'm like, that's the whole purpose is, there is no other way to resilience except to endure. Endurance is the only way, it's the only path to resilience. And so figuring out a way to flip that thing in your brain that makes you think that you've destroyed something. Instead, what you've actually done is open, a door to discovery. And if you can look at it as a positive, even in a terrible moment, then it can turn into one of those life lessons that sticks with you forever.
You can build on it.
Yeah, you can build on it. Because, you can't build on, you ask somebody what's formative in their life, like what has made you who you are? Nobody says, oh, well, I made A's in 8th grade. Like, it's not, our brain doesn't go to the positive things. The formative things are the struggles. That's what makes us who we are, is the struggles themselves and how we've responded to them. And, we humans are built kind of to try to somehow avoid pain. And I'm fond of saying that not only is it unavoidable, it's actually, it's destructive to try to avoid it. Because avoiding pain doesn't teach you anything. And there will come a time where the pain is unavoidable. And if you haven't been there before, you don't know how to handle it.
Yeah, a lot of your pain, as we jump back, just like myself, right? It's kind of like early on, whether we're predisposed as alcoholics or addicts, you go to North Carolina. You're on campus there in 1980. You go there. You get an invite to walk on the football team, and you show up on campus. That's got to be an exciting deal. It's an exciting time. North Carolina's awesome. I've been there. You're hanging out on Franklin Street, having a good time. What happens when you arrive on campus?
Well, because, obviously, Pete, I am the man. So the whole campus is going to be so excited that I'm there. Like their college experience can begin now that Charlie Engle has arrived on campus. Like everything's going to change. And, I mean, in high school, I was student body president and I made good grades and I played a lot of sports and dated the occasional cheerleader. And like I was, and I'm
guy.
like, I'm happy to say I think I was well liked and there's some things I'm proud of. It's a predominantly black high school and I was like the first white student body president. So I was happy with who I was. Well, I go to Carolina and like, I'm being funny, tongue in cheek when I say I thought there might be a banner on the dorm, like "Welcome, Charlie."
But I know what you mean.
But a week into it, I'm like, Jesus, I am so freaking average. Like I was just incredibly average. Like, I wasn't anywhere close to the smartest person. I certainly was just an average athlete. I went and observed a couple of football practices before walk-ons were invited. These were, closed practices, but I could go watch. I think the purpose of going to watch them was to give a dose of reality. And I'm like, hell no, I'm not getting out. I was still 6 feet, 180 pounds. And I mean, I was a slow-footed quarterback and a decent kicker. And I don't know what they thought they might do with me, but it was very clear that wasn't going to happen. So what I figured out really fast, Pete, was that the drinking age was still 18. And as, the universe clearly ordained me as special because I turned 18, the first couple of weeks of my freshman year in college. And I figured out in very, very short order that I was an all-American first-team drinker. I could just drink more than anybody else, period. And that became very, very quickly, that became my identity. I mean, it was years later after I left college that I realized backgammon wasn't actually just a drinking game. Because like, that's all it was good for in my dorm was drinking. And dude,
go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, no, I just wanted to say, it's early 80s. You're on a big college campus. I got to imagine cocaine is all over the place.
Yeah, I was getting you beat me to the punch. I was going to say, and it was the cocaine decade. I mean, coke is still around, of course, and a problem and a big deal and whatever. But then I am not kidding you. I didn't realize it was, I don't want to say I didn't realize it was illegal, but it was so ubiquitous on campus, like maybe the way weed is, at campuses today. And that it just didn't even occur to me that that it was illegal. I mean, I joined a fraternity, of course, because that's gonna help me with my drinking.
Yeah.
And and my coke use. And I figured out that
you did play. You played JV hoops, though.
I did.
Yeah.
So I did, in the audacity that I had to actually go out for the JV basketball. I mean, technically, this is the cool thing. At Carolina, you're technically going out for the basketball team. You're not necessarily going out for the JV team. Like, you're going out for the team. Yeah. I mean, 1 in a million guys. About once every 10 years, somebody moves up from JV to the varsity. So it's a rare occurrence. But so I made the team, but I made the JV team, of course. But it was at a time that, Roy Williams was the fourth coach on the bench. And so he was the JV coach. So not a bad guy to be coached by. After a year of that, I realized that, I certainly was never going to make varsity as a player, but I did have a fraternity brother who had made varsity as a manager. Weirdly, my uncle, so I have more history here. My dad's brother played basketball at Carolina, and he played for Coach Frank McGuire before Dean Smith started coaching. And then he ended up being a manager for Dean Smith. And my dad actually played on Dean's very first freshman team when he became coach. So, basketball was in my blood.
And you're also kind of, in a weird way, a legacy around there because people kind of know the name. Yeah.
Totally. Absolutely. And so, it was cool. And I got to be part of this JV program, but I knew I wasn't going to make it as a player. So I tried as a manager and so as a manager, I was
how'd you
for a
handle
year,
that
manager for a
responsibility?
year.
I mean, that's not an easy that's not an easy job. You're like the first person there and the last one to leave. You're rolling the balls out as a manager.
Here's the funny part, and Carolina's so smart about this, and I'm sure other programs are too. There were 4 JV managers, and the 4 of us are still close friends today, all 4 of us, because we were in the trenches together. We all knew that probably only one of us was going to get chosen as a varsity manager. So there was an inherent competition going all the time.
Yeah.
It was just built into it. And unfortunately, you can guess what got in the way for me.
Yeah.
It became pretty hard when, people would, Carolina's a big campus, but it ain't that big. And, people would know what you're doing and they'd know your business. And I know Coach Williams eventually found out that I was having some struggles. And I basically just, I shot myself in the foot for having any chance of being chosen as varsity manager. But I will say this, Pete, though, I showed up. I did.
Well, that's kind of in your DNA. That's kind of in your story.
Yeah.
We keep seeing that. You've always had that gear. You're doing coke and you're showing up. Either way, you're actually doing a hard job. What happens to you?
I was more determined hungover than most people were sober. So,
so what happens? What the hell happens to you? You kind of, your usage evolves. You're snorting coke and you're smoking crack. How does that happen?
Yeah. Well, and the evolution is, needless to say, 3 years into my college career, second semester junior year, I didn't go to a single class. And it's very weird how universities will actually kick you out if you don't go to class. I did not understand that, but, so they very, very politely asked me to leave. And in fact, my father, a fraternity brother, called my father and said, hey, and I was still great friends with that guy who made that phone call. He lives right here in North Carolina, close to me. And, he made the call, the hardest call that you could possibly make, I think, to my dad to say, hey, your son's in trouble.
Yeah, that's a shitload of integrity at that age.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and of course, I was both pissed and relieved all at the same time. I knew how badly I was screwing up. So my dad comes and gets me. He's living in Seattle at this point. And he comes to North Carolina?
Jesus.
Yeah, he comes and he packs my shit up and takes me back out, takes me back out there. And dude, I'm not kidding you. I get a job. He decides he's going to buy a franchise of some type, like in the fast food industry. And so I get a job as an assistant manager at a Wendy's. So I go from Chapel Hill to being an assistant manager at Wendy's. And what I did was start this pattern that a lot of addicts will relate to. For about 10 years, I basically would go somewhere. I would kick some ass for 6 months.
Yes.
Right? Whatever the job is, I am the man.
And then fucking Charlie shows up, right?
Exactly. And then I'm like, okay, I got this. I can have a beer.
Yeah.
And it's not like I wasn't having the occasional beer, but I would finally reach that point where I was ready to blow off some steam. And I spend the next 6 months losing the job, losing the apartment, losing the girlfriend, and I would move. And I moved to Atlanta, and I moved to New York, and I moved to LA, and I moved. I did a geographical change every 1 to 2 years for 10 years, and again, I went to California, and I sold Toyotas, and I was the number 1 Toyota salesman in the country for a couple of years. And that's a lot of cars. I'm selling 600 or 700 cars a year for a couple of years in a row.
Wow.
And making a lot of money, which I'm snorting off the back of the toilet in the employee bathroom, and, that's just the life I'm living. And I went to rehab, 25 years old, I go to rehab, started going to AA meetings early on. And I couldn't understand AA meetings because I went to AA, because I had heard that you could learn to control your drinking in AA. And so to me, what that meant was, because at this point, drinking was really screwing up my drug use.
Yeah.
And so, I went to AA trying to get a handle on this thing, not trying to stop.
We'll get back to this conversation in a second, but right now, a word from our sponsors.
The world looks different behind the handlebars of a Rad electric bike. Grabbing takeout looks less like greasy styrofoam boxes and more like a cross-town adventure. Ride shares look less like piling into the back of a car and more like grabbing fresh air with your friends. And commuting can even start to look like the best part of your day. That's because with Rad, the world is what you make of it, not what it makes of you. See for yourself with a 14-day free trial. Find your fun at radpowerbikes.com.
The all-new Chevy Colorado is made for more. Stacked with the latest in-vehicle technologies like a class-leading 11-inch diagonal center touchscreen and an extra-large wireless charging pad. Plus, it features wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto compatibility to make staying connected easy wherever your adventure takes you. Chevy Colorado, made for more. Learn more at Chevrolet.com/truck/Colorado. Claims based on latest competitive data.
And
at that point in time, when you go to rehab at 25, are you smoking crack at that point? Has it evolved?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Been smoking crack, and I stay sober for 6 months, and then I go completely off the rails. I mean, I'm the best sober person you've ever seen. Of course, I set a record for completing the 12 steps because I'm a genius, and and I overachieve all the way through. I went through 3 sponsors because, of course, they just didn't know how to handle me. And as it turns out, as we both know, this is a volunteer program. And when you're dealing with a pain in the ass sponsee, there comes a point where you're just saying, all right, man, you go do your thing.
Yeah.
Because I can't, this is not worth it. This is not what I signed up for. So, so I try all these things. I mean, I always like to say that I went to church, I saw a shaman, I went to rehab, and none of those things worked for me, of course, because I wasn't ready.
I love, and you're married at the time to your first wife.
Yeah.
And I've heard you, and this is in your book. It's a great way to go inside your relationship and the madness of your life when you tell the story about how you go out, your father-in-law's in town for a week, and you're hanging for like 5 or 6 days, and you're kind of like, you like the guy, right? Horace is his name, and you want to keep it in the fairway. And then what happens that last night?
Dude, that's so crazy. Like, I'm not kidding. I know I wrote this book, and I did write every word, but I haven't even thought about that story for a couple of years. I don't know why. It's so fun that you picked that, because it gave me goosebumps. Horace was a great guy, and he was an alcoholic in his life, and it was a medical thing, like, a heart problem that finally forced him to stop drinking. So, but he knew what it was like to be an alcoholic. And of course, my wife knew what it was like to live with one, because she had grown up with one in the house. So she was used to my craziness, my brand of craziness.
And imagine that, right? She ends up finding you after growing up
shocking.
in that. Yeah.
Shocking. And so, so I kept it together for, almost all the way up to that last night. And we went to this fancy steakhouse in Monterey, California, where we're living. And I mean, it was going to be our final celebration. And I, of course, scored some Coke that afternoon, but I wasn't going to touch it. I knew better. And of course, I had just a little. And so, I've got this $40 beautiful steak in front of me. I don't eat meat anymore, but in those days, I sure did. And I had this great steak and beautiful meal in front of me, and I couldn't eat it. Like, I was forcing it down, and I'd go into the bathroom and do another line. And I sort of think I'm keeping it together, and we get back to the house, and, luckily my wife's exhausted and her dad goes to bed, and I go to bed, pretend to go to sleep. And of course I slip out the door as soon as I think everybody's, asleep. And I'm going to get, I don't know if you ever did this, but like, I'm going to get back by 3 o'clock. I'm going to get back by 4 o'clock in the morning. I'm going to get back by 5. Like, over and over. And I slip out into I think I went to a bowling alley that was open all night, and all the best people hung out there. and like, and of course, by the time I finally dragged myself back to the house, it's 6 a.m. and I go into the garage because we have a detached garage at the house, and I can see there's a light on in the kitchen, and I'm thinking, oh man, they're awake, or my father-in-law's awake. I get naked, I change into running clothes that are there at the washer dryer, and I put these running clothes on, and I spray myself, like I splash my face and my hair with water. And like, I jog in place and I run into the kitchen. I open the door and I'm like, man, had a great run. And they're both just looking at me like, yeah, we've been up since 4.
And your wife had told her dad everything.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm standing there in the kitchen with my running shorts and water from the sink dripping off of me like sweat, just the biggest jerk in the entire world. And and he was incredibly understanding, and we took him to the airport. But it was, out of all the humiliating things I did, I think that was,
well, it's up there, right? And that's just like me.
10.
Yeah, exactly. There's probably 50 other, which is kind of for people that are listening to this that aren't addicts. And the best part is, dude, we can laugh about it now because you're sober, and that's how we stay sober to a degree with one another. We're vulnerable. We're talking about it. It's relatable because the Charlie Engle running through the Sahara at 15 years sober may not be relatable for people, but that is, and sharing those stories is so important. So I appreciate you sharing that one, because it's a real microcosm and a look into the shit we do. I mean, that's one of like 40 times that probably happened.
Yeah, it was crazy and funny. I mean, it should be a Saturday Night Live skit. Or I'm actually thrilled that you told that you reminded me of that, because I have an upcoming event outing where I tell my normal story that I've gotten used to telling, and I don't dig into some of the fun stories like that, and I'm gonna break that one back out. And I think some of that is because in front of people, and you're doing it right now, and on your show, where I share the struggle. Too often you listen to people, and I'm not being critical of other sober people, but it's so deeply steeped in either the deepest debauchery and the drug use part of it, or it's all about how incredibly successful they are today. And I'm I relate to both of those things to a certain degree, but man, it's the struggle that people relate to. And I'd rather dump all my shit out on stage and let people pick through it however they want to, just like in the book, and, let them figure out what they relate to, and instead of me telling them.
Well, it's the attraction, right? It's a attraction, not promotion. And that's attractive when people just lay it out there. So your story is amazing. Again, people can get the book, but you finally come to that point. You have a son, and then the light starts to flicker, I guess. And then a couple months after, you go on another huge binge, but that is what leads you to get sober. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. Well, the birth of my son, I was counting on him to basically save me, and, and I'm not the first to think that way. I thought surely I can stay sober for him. And I felt love from him and for him that as an addict, I just didn't think I was capable or deserving of. And so like I was determined, man. And, he and my wife come visit me, and I'm in Wichita, Kansas on a job. I have my own business, and, certain things. My attitude was always this: if you can buy a house back in my 20s, like if I could buy a house, surely I can't be an addict.
Yeah.
If I can find somebody to marry me, I can't be an addict. If I can have a kid, I can't be an addict. Like I did all these things to sort of just, prove
that was kind of my
point.
dad's like family's mentality. Like if you've got a job, because there was alcoholism all over the place, but if you've got a job, you can kind of you can fend off the posse. Yeah.
Right. How bad can it be? Well, so in this case, that's the way I lived my life, and I had this business and I chased hailstorms around the country. It was really weird. It was perfect because I made a lot of money and I could run my own time.
You fix cars after hailstorms.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I could drink and I could party and I could do all this stuff. And so I'm in Wichita, but I'm behaving myself because I've got this son and my wife and son come out and visit for a week. And like, it's literally to this day, one of the best weeks of my life. Like I've got this little baby and it's just a magical week. And I've dropped them at the airport, kissed them goodbye, and it's incredible. And I dropped 20 minutes later, I'm smoking crack in the worst neighborhood in town, and nothing happened. Like there's no trigger as we might think of it. I didn't get fired. I didn't lose a job. Nobody stole money. Like we didn't have an argument. I didn't have anything to like put this binge on. I just simply drove straight to the neighborhood where I knew to go, and I started smoking crack, and I did it for 6 straight days, and without even popping my head out of the room practically. And and that 6-day binge ended up with me handcuffed on the ground and the police searching my car and bullet holes in the car. And, and I'd love to say that's the first time that had ever happened. It's not. But the most important piece of it was I did have this very clear thought, just echoing through my head. Nobody's coming to save you, and it was the most useful thought I'd ever had. It's like my baby son can't save me. My wife certainly couldn't. None of the bosses I ever had, could save me. And everybody's willing to help as soon as I was finally willing to commit to something, to a program of recovery. And, I went to an AA meeting that night, and it's the first one I ever went to. I'd been to dozens before then, but the first one I ever went to was an open heart and a curious mind. And I sat there and listened, and I got up the next day and I went for a run, and I decided I would do those two things for 30 days. And then I decided I'd keep going for 90 days. And at 90 days, I couldn't, there was no reason to quit. And I felt like my life was getting better. And so I ended up doing those things for 3 years and, slowly began to build a life for myself.
What did you find in recovery that kept you coming back?
I found honesty. I found fellowship, and I'm just going to say this, after almost 30 years sober, I've had a million discussions about AA and about 12-step recovery. And, what I can say is, sure, there's dogma, there's things that maybe I don't relate to, but my first, sponsor was the first guy to say to me, take what you can use and leave the rest.
That's what you just said, kind of about your talks. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. And I always just leave it at that. The guy who's saying the same thing you've heard him say 25 times in the same meeting, and you're thinking to yourself, if I have to hear this guy say this one more time,
yeah,
I'm gonna like throw something. It's learning how to set those things aside and find the nuggets, find the beauty and the useful things in the meetings. And having a human being actually care whether you show up or not somewhere is a huge thing. And so I tell people all the time who struggle with like going to AA, I'm like, okay, that's fine. It can be church, it can be your running group, you can join a vegan group, you can quilt. It doesn't matter, but you have to care about other people some way, like really care about them, and they have to care about you and whether or not you show up. And that was the first time in my life, because I had, my middle name should have been Aloof up to that first 30 years, because I always made sure that, I sort of floated in and out, and nobody ever really knew where I was or what I was doing. And I liked it that way as an addict. And I had to learn to set that aside, and that desire to hide and to be visible and allow myself to not only be helped, but to help other people. And quite honestly, what I got out of it more than anything is John, the first sponsor I had, he was in his 70s when I got sober in Wichita, and I was 29 years old at this point. And, he was the first guy to say to me, to keep it, you have to give it away. And he didn't just say it. He taught me a funny lesson. I've already told too many stories about, so one more short one. So and this isn't in the book even, but so I'm not kidding. On like day 2 of John being my sponsor, I said, John, you've been sober for like 40 something years. There's got to be a secret.
You're looking for a hack, just like everybody else, right? Yeah, totally.
Right. There's got to be a trick to this. What is it? And he was so smart. He goes, dude, you're absolutely right. He's like, you come to the 8:00 meeting tonight. You show up at 7:30, and we're going to sit down and have a chat. And I'm like, oh, I knew it. I show up at 7:30 this meeting. I said, okay, John. I said, I'm so excited. Thanks for taking the time. He's like, I'm so glad you're here, Charlie. But before we talk, you see those coffee pots over there? This meeting needs 5 pots of coffee, and my guy didn't show up tonight. Can you just go make the coffee? And I'm like, yeah, no problem. I got it. So of course it takes me 30 minutes to make 5 pots of coffee. And, the meeting happens, and after the meeting, I come up to John. He's like, yeah, I gotta get home. Dogs need to be fed. Just come tomorrow at 7:30 and, we'll talk then. And of course you see where this is going already. I end up showing up, for 30 days straight. It only took me like 4 or 5 days to catch on because I'm a little slow.
Yeah.
But what he taught me was, and something, I'm not kidding when I say not a single person ever thanked me for making the coffee because they didn't know I was making it. People show up at 2 minutes till 8:00.
Sure. Yeah. Or late.
They get their cup of coffee. Right. So nobody's thanking me. And it's probably the first thing I ever did in my life that was of service that I didn't expect to be somehow recognized or thanked. And what that simple lesson taught me was the beauty of giving back without the expectation of either acknowledgement or some sort of financial return or whatever it might be. And, and I understood that in fact was the hack. And I'm happy to say that almost 30 years later, I when I'm stuck, I look to service, and I don't mean it in some goody two shoes way. Whatever I do some good things. I don't do as much as I feel like I should sometimes. Whatever. I'm just a normal human. But I always know that the fastest way for me to get unstuck is to help somebody else get unstuck.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like you always hear it, right? Or maybe people are hearing it for the first time. It's like, who are you helping? If I'm walking around complaining, and it's really hard to even wrap my mind around that movement, going from self-pity to helping somebody. But it's like you said earlier, if you can find that ability to kind of break through that wall, you can keep doing it, and you understand how purposeful that is and how fulfilling that is, and it can snap you out of those funks where we're not helping anybody if we're walking around all selfed up in this darkness that's like self-imposed.
Well, and when you help somebody, especially a sober person or somebody who's trying to get sober, I freely admit, man, I see that guy walk through the doors and he's got 2 days of sobriety. I'm looking at him and like going, shit, I am so glad I'm not that guy.
Yeah.
It's not about a lack of compassion. I mean, I'm here to help him. I'll have a talk with him, but I desperately need to see that guy because my inner addict that still is alive and well inside me, he's still telling me like my friends did back in the day, you weren't so bad. You weren't that bad. You could probably, have a beer or two if you wanted to. Like
well,
that guy still lives inside me.
That's the connective tissue between. That's why you go to meetings, because you see that guy and it's like, oh yeah, that was me. All right, so I want to move into. We don't have a ton of time left. So what happens? How do you end up running the Sahara Desert for people that don't know? Running the Sahara. Well, that's a documentary produced by Matt Damon. I mean, it's there's so much other stuff. If you check out Charlie's book, I mean, literally you're working on the What's that show you're working on with Ty Pennington? Extreme Home.
Yeah.
I mean, you end up
Makeover Home Edition. Yeah.
Yeah, you're like a key cog in that wheel. That's that. Anybody that remembers that show, it was people used to like lose their shit over like that show. It was a number one rated show. So you're working on that, and then you get this bug up your ass about running across the Sahara, or you get this opportunity. I say that tongue in cheek. What happens?
Yeah, well, I had, during those first 3 years of running, I ran like 30 or 35 marathons. And I do always make the joke because, like, clearly I had that whole addiction thing under control. And, and I was running like crazy. But I found so much comfort and wisdom in voluntary suffering. And I mean, that's what I call it. I chose to put myself in hard positions because I understood early on that the more often I could get through that wall we talked about earlier, the more that would translate to stopping me from relapsing or stopping me from doing some other bad, choice. And so, my life got better, and I started a couple of businesses. I got a call from a guy who was the creator of Extreme Makeover Home Edition because, we had met in the Borneo jungle on an Eco Challenge show. Mark Burnett's first, I was in the Eco Challenge in Borneo, and Mark Burnett was producing. And, anyway, this guy from CBS, he calls me 2 years later, and he's like, "Look, Charlie, you are completely unqualified for this job. But if you don't tell anybody, I want to hire you to come on the show and be a producer." And I was a cameraman, and like I got to be creative and talk to people. And that, at the same time, I'm doing races all over the world, and I'm actually winning a lot of these races that are 100-milers or hundreds of miles across the Gobi Desert, Atacama Desert. Like, I'm doing this stuff all over the place. And I go to the Amazon to do a race, and a guy who was in the race with me blurts out this crazy idea. I wonder if everybody's run across the Sahara. And I told him it was the dumbest idea I'd ever heard. And but I got an introduction to a guy named James Mall, who was a director, and James loved the idea. And this guy had won the Academy Award for Best Documentary a couple of years earlier. And he calls Matt Damon. I didn't know he was doing that, but James calls me and says, "Hey, I just hung up with Matt, and he would like to executive produce and narrate this film. Would that be okay with you?" And I can honestly tell you, because I like to try to be funny anyway, I took a beat for 4 or 5 seconds, and I said, like, I was really hoping for somebody better, but yeah, Matt Damon would be all right.
Yeah, that'll do.
Hans Zimmer comes on board to do the score for the film. So, like, I've got 3 Academy Award winners for a film about me running across sand and riveting stuff. And, and I have, this is the addict. And I say this all the time. And addicts and people in recovery understand this. We are the best salesmen in history. If you want to sell something, hire someone who's in recovery, because we know how to tell a freaking story.
Yeah.
And make shit up. And like that, I felt like that's what I had done. And I'd suckered all of these people into believing in this idea. And a year later, I'm at the coast of Senegal with 2 other runners, one of them being the guy who actually blurted out this idea to begin with. So I taught him a lesson. I made him go with me. And, and it's the day before we're going to start running 5,000 miles across the Sahara Desert. And, I'm looking around and thinking, I'm going to get all these people killed. There's no way we're going to. And a week into this expedition, it's 140 degrees ground temperature every day. It's both my 2 teammates are on IV fluids. We've got vehicles that have blown up. Support people have quit. Hollywood's calling to say we're pulling the plug on this. And I think this is the important point. What I recognized in that moment, Pete, was that I was going about it all wrong. I felt so much pressure to get to the finish line, so to speak. Millions of dollars were invested. All these people were watching, and I needed to get to Egypt. So I was so focused on the goal that I forgot the only miles that I could run were the ones that were right in front of me today, like right here, right now. just like sobriety. You get so worried about being sober forever that you forget that you only have to be sober today. And slowly I began to make my way across the Sahara by focusing on, I ran a marathon every morning. I'd take a break for lunch. I'd run a marathon in the afternoon.
And that's how you saw it.
I'd take a break at night. Yeah. And by the time it was over, I'd run 2 marathons a day for 111 consecutive days without taking a day off. And we made it all the way to the other side of the Sahara. I mean, it's crazy to think back about.
It's insane. And if people want to watch the documentary, it's Running the Sahara. You come off like a bit of a prick, but I think that's all there's points in there. Well, I mean, it's
Who
like.
says I'm not? Who says I'm not?
Well, and the reason I've heard you say that, but I mean, it's, the edit doesn't do you great justice. This is your words, and, it's kind of it's like if you ever watch The Real World, people know how that goes, right? And then it's the people. I think it's like, who's clutching their pearls, thinking anybody could be a dick on that. Anybody that's been in a competitive environment or is driven to do something. Hey man, you're going to get banged around a little bit. There's going to be infighting and there's going to be a lot of emotion. That's how you get better and get things done.
Well, there was a sober guy who came as a cameraman about 2/3 of the way through that expedition. We had never met before.
No way.
He's watching me, my behavior. I'm yelling at people. I'm throwing tantrums. I haven't had a meeting now for 90 days at this point, and I am running 50 miles every day, and I'm trying to keep this train moving. And I didn't know he was sober. We didn't know each other. He pulls me aside one day, or we're just sitting, near each other, and he says, "Hey, man," I don't remember what the keywords were, but he said a couple things that I knew he was sober, right?
Yeah.
He goes, and he said something so impactful. He's like, you have so much compassion for the people of the Sahara, for your teammates. I mean, even if you're yelling at them, I think it was obvious that I really loved them. He says, you got all this compassion, but have you ever given yourself a break? Do you have any compassion for yourself? And I mean, I recognize that, and this isn't like a woe is me thing. I just recognized in that moment, thanks to him, that I was not willing to cut myself any slack whatsoever. And I felt so much pressure to make this thing successful that I was ruining it for myself and for everybody else, because I just couldn't embrace the moment in a way.
I think all alcoholics can relate, or sober people. I mean, sometimes you're just gripping the wheel too tight.
Yep. And I wanted to control everything. I wanted to force everybody to enjoy the hell out of this.
Yeah.
and look, I know we don't have much time left, but the Matt Damon and I created something called H2O Africa out of that project, and I raised about $6 million over the 6 to 9 months during the expedition and after. And today that organization is called water.org, and it's the world's largest clean water nonprofit. And I only mention that because I'm no philanthropist. I certainly didn't have some brilliant idea. I knew I wanted to do some good out of this run. But I encourage people, listen to this. Everybody's going to tell you can't do something. Whatever that crazy idea is you want to do, they're going to say it has no value. Some people might support you, but more often than not, they're going to suggest that you stick to your lane and you stay in the safe zone. And nothing good is ever found in the safe zone.
Yeah, outside of the comfort zone is where the growth happens. Yeah. Last thing for you, and we got to touch on this because it's a wrinkle, and it's turned in my estimation to a positive wrinkle. In 2010, I mean, I don't know about positive, but you certainly learned from it and helped other people. You go to prison. And for people that don't know, I'll just say it because I've done my crack research. I've got some journalism in me a little bit, but I mean, you got totally screwed, and I'll just leave it at that. There's a New York Times article that people can read, but what exactly happens to you? I mean, you go to prison for 16 months?
Yeah. Well, this is my favorite moment on stage, Pete. When I'm doing a talk in front of a big group of people live, I've just taken them across the Sahara, and my life is good.
It's what
right?
a curveball,
Everything
dude.
is good.
Yeah.
I'm no longer smoking crack, and my life is good. And I'm like, I come back to my condo, and I get arrested by 6 federal agents, and I end up in jail, and I go to trial. And I mean, in short, for listeners, they can find all this info even on my website. But I'm the only person in the country that gets charged with overstating my income on a home loan application from 2005. And ultimately, I go to trial. I'm found not guilty of that, but I'm guilty of mail fraud on a technicality. And again, I'm not going to get into the details. But I go to prison. I'm sentenced to 21 months in federal prison in Beckley, West Virginia. In the federal system, you get as I like to say, a 15% discount up front. So I was going to have to serve 18 months. 16 of those were in the prison. 2 months were in a halfway house. And, and this was everything was gone. People think cancel culture is like a new thing. The day I got arrested in 2010, the very next day, my sponsors all kicked me out. I was booted off the board of 2 nonprofits.
When you say sponsors, we're talking about like financial sponsors, like money.
Finance, like some of my, socks and shoes and athletic gear and protein powder, whatever. They all dropped me. I don't blame them. It's the way the world is. I mean, forget about being found guilty. This was just the day after I was arrested.
Yeah.
And so my life, as I like to say, I'm purged from my life. And on Valentine's Day, 2011, my teenage boys dropped me off at the front gate of Beckley Federal Correctional Institute in Beckley, West Virginia. And it takes me a little while to find my footing, like literally, but I start running. Same thing as I always do. And the super short version is, there's 500 guys in this prison. And when I got there, there really wasn't a single, like what I'd call runner there. And I just, attraction rather than promotion. I started running every single day. People made fun of me. I do yoga out on the softball field by myself, which I do not recommend if you ever go to federal prison. Yeah. But, I took a lot of heat. But the craziest thing happened. 3 months into my stay, guys started coming up to me and saying, "Hey man," in the cafeteria line, they're like, "Hey man, can you help me run? I've never run before, and I'd like to learn." And the only reason they did that is they actually saw my life getting better. And by the time I left Beckley, I had a running group of 50 guys, running with me every single day, and 25 guys doing yoga on the softball field 3 days a week.
And you're educating people on addiction. You're really carrying the message. So what's a couple things, 1 or 2 things people don't know about going to prison that they should know?
You really learn how to live economically sound in your daily life, because having credit in prison is a really bad idea.
Okay.
So that's one. I'll also give a tip. Like, this is the greatest tip I can give you. If you go to prison, become a vegan or a vegetarian, because the thing that has the greatest value in prison is the chicken and the hamburgers. Oh. So like me, if you don't eat those things, you can trade them for all kinds of other amazing, wonderful things that you can't normally acquire in prison. And I'm being tongue in cheek, but like running shoes and, Gatorade and other things like that. I guess I would also say this was minimum security. And on a serious note, 80% of the guys in there were there for nonviolent drug offenses. And it is the biggest waste of taxpayer money in the world. Even if you're a tough on crime person as a listener, if you're a conservative, tough on crime person, you are spending a fortune of tax dollars on keeping people in prison because they bought a bag of weed from the wrong guy. If you're a violent offender, then, I'm not saying that those folks, even if they were high when they did it, I would like to give them another chance too, but I also understand why that's a little tougher sell. But most of the people who are in prison, those kind of prisons, are there for some ridiculous thing that pays off lobbyists and politicians and keeps the prisons full and doesn't help society or humanity one bit.
Yeah, and guess what you're doing right there? You just shared your experience. So, I mean, that's
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's what you
Yeah.
experienced there. So anything else before I let you run out of here? Anything else?
Yeah. Yeah. The final thing I'll say is I talk freely about this stuff because I want to help erase the stigma of all this stuff. And I think you're the same,
Totally.
of the same mindset, because we think people care about our shit way more than they actually do. I never go into a talk that I don't talk about addiction and prison and the struggles that I've had. And it's good times and bad times, but we're self-centered human beings. That's what human beings really are. And people don't care nearly as much about this stuff. In fact, if you share your struggles with them, they're way more likely to be on your side and pull for you. And I think that's the important lesson that I try to give. And the final things I'll say is, look, you asked about my 30-year sober anniversary, which is coming up in July. And as you know, I will be running for 30 straight hours.
Yeah, it's part of Ashley addiction treatment, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, movement for recovery. It sounds pretty awesome. And I'll drop the link in the show notes. But yeah, what exactly does that mean to you to do that?
Dude, I've been doing it for years. And so for years, on my sober birthday, I will run for the same number of hours to equal the years I've been sober. And I started this around 10 years sober. Needless to say, it's getting harder. I'm almost 60 years old, and I am, even though I try not to project forward. Somebody did ask me the other day, it's like, what happens when you're 70? Are you really going to go 40 hours? And I basically am like, I hope so.
Beats the alternative.
Slow and yeah, hell yeah. And and look, this is about movement, and I am a huge proponent of, in treatment centers and in sobriety, there's too many people who are still smoking or eating terrible foods and doing other bad habits, even years into their sobriety. And we spend a lot of years beating our bodies up, and I encourage movement. Not running. It doesn't have to be running. It doesn't have to be, you can walk 3 days a week and do a little bit of yoga and stretching and greatly improve your life. So that's what this is about.
We're going to we'll drop all your info in the show notes, man. Charlie Engle, I cannot thank you enough, dude. This was really awesome.
Pete, this is the best conversation I've had in a very long time, and I thank you for having it. The time flew by.
All right, cool. I'll send you a link to this when it comes out. I appreciate you, Charlie.
Yeah, brother. Thank you so much, dude. Seriously.
You got me. Okay.
Right.
Thanks so much for listening to The Payoff with Pete. Once again, I'm Pete Souza. And of course, we are part of the Rogue Media Network. All kinds of good podcasts you can find at roguemedianetwork.com. And of course, you can find this podcast and all those other ones wherever you get your podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, other spots like that.
This has been a Rogue Media podcast.